It started on an ordinary evening, just like any other. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting golden streaks across the sky as Sergeant Daniel Carter made his way home. Fresh out of deployment, he was finally back on familiar soil, trying to adjust to civilian life once again. The world around him felt both the same and completely different. The streets were quiet, the air crisp, but something inside him still carried the weight of the battlefield. His mind was a battlefield of its own. Memories of his time overseas played like a film reel, sometimes too fast, sometimes too slow. He had seen things he wished he could forget, but some moments, some faces, would never fade. As he walked down the sidewalk, something caught his attention: a dog. Thin, ragged, and clearly a stray, the animal trailed behind him, keeping a cautious yet determined distance. At first, Daniel didn't think much of it. Stray dogs weren't uncommon, especially near the outskirts of town. But there was something different about this one. It wasn't just looking for food or shelter. It was following him with purpose, as if it knew him. Daniel stopped, turning slowly to face the dog. It froze, ears perked up, its deep brown eyes locked onto his. There was a strange familiarity in its gaze, something that made his chest tighten. He crouched down, extending a hand. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. The dog hesitated for only a moment before taking cautious steps toward him. Then, in an instant, it closed the distance, pressing its head against his knee. A lump formed in Daniel's throat. The way the dog reacted, it wasn't just the desperate trust of a stray. It was something deeper, something unspoken. He ran a hand over its fur, feeling the thin ribs beneath. This dog had been through a lot. It had traveled far. But why had it followed him? And why did he feel like he had seen this dog before? With gentle hands, he checked for a collar. Nothing. Just tangled fur and old scars. That's when he noticed something. A small lump beneath the skin near its neck. A microchip. That meant this dog had a home once. Maybe it still did. Maybe someone was out there looking for it. Curiosity gnawed at him. He couldn't just leave the animal out here, not after it had followed him so far. Making a quick decision, he carefully scooped the dog up and carried it home. Inside, he gave it food and water, watching as it devoured the meal like it hadn't eaten in days. As it settled onto the floor, eyes heavy with exhaustion, Daniel reached for his phone. He had a friend who worked at a nearby vet clinic. If the dog had a chip, they could scan it and find out where it belonged. The next morning, he took the dog to the clinic. His friend, Lisa, greeted him with a knowing smile. "Got yourself a new best friend?" she teased, reaching for the scanner. Daniel chuckled, but there was something uneasy in his chest. He watched as she ran the device over the dog's neck, waiting for the beep. And then it came, a soft, electronic chime. Lisa's smile faded as she looked at the screen. Her brows knitted together, her eyes scanning the information. She looked up at Daniel, her face suddenly pale. "What?" Daniel asked, his heart pounding. She swallowed hard, glancing at the dog, then back at him. "Daniel, this microchip is registered to someone overseas. And the name on the file, it's someone you know." His breath caught in his throat. That wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But as Lisa turned the screen toward him, his entire world shifted. Because staring back at him was a name he never thought he'd see again. A name that should have been impossible. And in that moment, everything he thought he knew came crashing down. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears as he stared at the name on the screen. His mind refused to process it. He felt like the ground beneath him had shifted, like reality itself was bending in a way that didn't make sense. Lisa glanced at him, concern written all over her face. "Daniel, are you okay?" she asked, her voice softer now. He barely heard her. His eyes were locked on the name. It wasn't just any name. It was someone he had lost, someone he had grieved. Corporal James Reynolds. Daniel took a step back, gripping the edge of the counter for support. The name alone sent a flood of memories crashing into him. James had been more than just a fellow soldier. He had been Daniel's closest friend. They had trained together, fought together, survived things most people couldn't even imagine. And then one day, James was gone. It had happened in the middle of a mission, deep in unfamiliar territory. Chaos erupted. Gunfire filled the air, and in the madness of it all, James disappeared. At first, they thought he had been taken. They searched for weeks, refusing to give up hope. But as time passed and no signs of him were found, the worst possibility became reality. James was declared missing in action, then eventually presumed dead. Daniel had never fully accepted it. He had nightmares for months, hearing his friend's voice calling out, seeing glimpses of him in crowds that turned out to be nothing but tricks of his exhausted mind. Losing James was like losing a piece of himself. And now, standing here in a quiet veterinary clinic, that name was staring back at him. Lisa cleared her throat. "Daniel, this can't be right, can it?" He forced himself to swallow, his mouth dry. "This has to be a mistake," he muttered, shaking his head. But even as he said it, doubt crept in. Lisa hesitated before speaking again. "The microchip is registered under his name. That means this was his dog." Daniel looked down at the stray, who was sitting by his feet, watching him with those same deep, knowing eyes. Suddenly, he saw it differently. The recognition, the way it had followed him so deliberately. It wasn't a coincidence. This dog had known him. And if the dog was here, then what did that mean for James? His mind raced through the possibilities. Maybe someone else had taken the dog after James was gone. Maybe it had been passed around, abandoned, left to wander. But something about that didn't sit right. This dog had come straight to him, like it had been searching for him, like it had a message he couldn't yet understand. "Where was the microchip last registered?" he asked, his voice quieter now, tinged with something even he couldn't name. Lisa glanced back at the screen. "Hold on." She clicked through the database, scanning through the information. After a few seconds, she exhaled sharply. "This doesn't make sense." Daniel clenched his jaw. "What?" "The last update on this microchip wasn't from years ago. It was from 3 weeks ago." His stomach dropped. That was impossible. If James had been gone all this time, then why was there recent activity connected to his name? His mind struggled to find a logical explanation, but nothing fit. "Where?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lisa hesitated before reading it aloud. "Somewhere overseas." The location is vague, but it's marked near the same region where James went missing. Daniel felt like he couldn't breathe. The pieces of the puzzle weren't fitting together, but they were leading to one undeniable conclusion. James' story wasn't over. His hands curled into fists as memories surged back. James' laugh, his stubborn determination, the last words they had exchanged before that fateful mission. If there was even the smallest chance that he was still out there, Daniel had to find out the truth. The dog nudged his hand gently, pulling him from his thoughts. Looking down, he saw those same loyal eyes staring up at him, waiting. It was like the animal knew he was on the edge of something huge, something bigger than either of them. Lisa exhaled, crossing her arms. "Daniel, what are you thinking?" He didn't answer right away. His mind was already working through the next steps, piecing together what little information he had. He had contacts, old military friends, people who might be able to dig into records that weren't public. If there was any trail, any sign of James, he had to follow it. Finally, he met Lisa's gaze. "I need to find out what happened to him." She studied him for a moment before nodding. "I figured you'd say that." She handed him a printout of the microchip's information. "This is everything I could pull from the database. It's not much, but maybe it'll help." He took the paper, his fingers tightening around it. "Thank you." Lisa sighed. "Just be careful, okay?" Daniel managed a small smile, though his heart was pounding with a mix of fear and determination. "I always am." But as he left the clinic, the dog trotting beside him like a shadow, he knew this wasn't going to be simple. Somewhere out there, in a past he thought was buried, was the truth. And he was going to find it. Daniel barely noticed the cold evening air as he walked back home. The stray, no, James' dog, sticking close to his side. His mind was a storm of questions, none of them with answers that made sense. If James was gone, why was his dog here? And why was his name still linked to a recent microchip scan? Was it possible James had survived? And if he had, why hadn't he come home? The thought sent a chill through him. He had spent years believing his best friend had been lost forever. If there was even the smallest chance that wasn't true, he had to find out what really happened. When he got home, He poured food into a bowl for the dog, watching as it ate with an eagerness that suggested it hadn't had a real meal in a while. Daniel leaned against the counter, running a hand over his face. He needed to think. He needed a place to start. His military contacts, some still active, others retired, could help track movement records in the region where James disappeared. But reaching out meant stirring up old ghosts, asking questions that some people might not want answered. His phone buzzed on the table. A message from Lisa. "Are you okay?" Daniel exhaled. "Not really, but I need to figure this out." A few seconds later, another message appeared. I did a little more digging. The Microchip's last update came from a private security network. Not military, not civilian either. His fingers tightened around the phone. That complicated things. If James had been alive and under military supervision, Daniel would have expected some kind of classified report. But a private security firm? That was different. That meant secrecy. That meant someone didn't want the details to be public. The dog finished eating and padded over to him, resting its head against his leg. Daniel absently scratched behind its ears, his mind racing. He needed to make a call. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. Ryan Calloway. Ryan had been a field operative before shifting into intelligence work. If anyone could pull restricted information without setting off too many alarms, it was him. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Didn't expect to hear from you, Carter. I need a favor." A pause. Then, "How deep?" Daniel glanced at the dog. "Deeper than I like." Ryan sighed. "All right. What am I looking for?" "A soldier who went missing years ago. Officially MIA. But something tells me he might not be." Another pause. Then Ryan's voice dropped. "Give me a name." Daniel hesitated. Saying it out loud made the weight of it real. "James Reynolds." Silence. Then, "Are you messing with me?" Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. "I wish I was." Ryan exhaled. "Carter, that's not a name I expected to hear again. But if you're telling me there's something off." "There is." Daniel gave him the microchip details. "Can you find out where this data was last accessed?" Ryan was quiet for a moment. "I can try. But if someone doesn't want this information found, it might take a while. I don't care how long it takes." Ryan sighed. "All right. I'll see what I can do. But Carter, be careful." The call ended, but Daniel's thoughts were anything but settled. He sat down on the couch, the dog curling up beside him. Its breathing slowed, its body relaxing for the first time in what was probably days. Daniel wasn't sure if he'd be able to do the same. Sleep didn't come easily that night. His mind replayed old memories, fragments of conversations with James, the laughter, the plans they had made for life after the military, the mission that went wrong, the moment Daniel turned and James was gone. His dreams were restless. Shadows moved through the fog of his mind. A voice, faint, distant, calling his name. When he woke up, the dog was watching him. The next morning, his phone rang. "Ryan, I found something," Ryan said, his voice edged with something Daniel couldn't quite place. Daniel sat up, his heart already pounding. "Tell me." Ryan hesitated. "The last ping on that microchip, it wasn't just a generic security network. It's linked to an organization that operates off the grid. No official ties. No paper trails. These guys deal in things that don't make it into reports." Daniel's stomach clenched. "What kind of things?" "Private missions. Extraction ops. Recovering assets." A pause. "Or people?" Daniel went still. Ryan continued. "I don't know what they wanted with Reynolds. But whatever it was, someone went to a lot of trouble to keep it quiet." Daniel's mind raced. If James had been alive all this time, was he a prisoner? A recruit? Or was he trying to get out of something bigger than either of them had ever imagined? Ryan sighed. "Look, Carter, I don't know what your next move is, but if you go digging, you need to be ready for whatever you find." Daniel looked at the dog curled up at his feet. The animal had come to him for a reason. And now, he had no choice but to follow the trail it had led him to. "I have to do this," Daniel said. Ryan was quiet for a moment before muttering, "Yeah, I figured you'd say that." The line went dead. Daniel exhaled, his thoughts spinning. Somewhere out there, the truth was waiting, and he wasn't going to stop until he found it. Daniel's heart pounded as he sat in the dimly lit room, staring at the notes he had scribbled across the table. Strings of disconnected facts, locations, and unanswered questions sprawled before him, but they all led to one undeniable truth. James wasn't just gone. Someone had made sure of that. The dog lay nearby, resting its head on its paws, watching him in silence. It had been days since Daniel first found it, but the weight of its presence hadn't faded. If anything, it felt heavier now, like the dog knew something he didn't. His phone buzzed, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Ryan's name flashed on the screen. "Tell me you found something," Daniel said as he picked up. Ryan's voice was low, urgent. "I don't know if you're going to like what I found." Daniel stood, already pacing. "Just tell me." There was a pause before Ryan spoke again. "The organization linked to James Microchip? They aren't just some random private firm. They deal in classified recoveries, soldiers' intelligence, people who go missing under complicated circumstances." Daniel clenched his jaw. "You're saying they took him?" "I'm saying they found him," Ryan corrected. "But that's not the part that doesn't make sense." Another pause. "Carter?" James was listed as recovered 3 years ago. Daniel stopped moving. His grip on the phone tightened. "Recovered?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Yeah, but here's the thing. There's no record of him being returned. No report, no debrief, nothing. It's like they found him and then erased him." Daniel felt his pulse hammer in his ears. "Where was he last seen?" Ryan hesitated. "I managed to pull coordinates from an old log. But Carter, listen to me. Whoever was involved in this, they didn't want anyone looking. If you go there, you're not just poking around in old files. You're stepping into something bigger." Daniel's grip tightened. "Send me the location." Ryan sighed. "I knew you'd say that." A moment later, a text came through. Daniel hung up without another word, staring at the coordinates on his screen. A remote compound, barely marked on any map. Deep in a region where people disappeared without a trace. The weight in his chest grew heavier. If James had been there, if he had survived all these years, why hadn't he come home? Daniel packed a bag quickly, just the essentials. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't walk away without answers. The dog stirred, watching as Daniel slung the bag over his shoulder. "You're coming with me, aren't you?" he murmured. The dog didn't move. It didn't have to. Daniel took a deep breath and stepped out into the night. The journey was long, the roads narrowing into winding paths, then fading into dirt trails. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became. By the time he reached the outskirts of the marked coordinates, the only sound was the steady hum of the wind. The compound was hidden beyond an abandoned structure, the kind of place no one would look twice at. He parked a safe distance away, scanning the area before moving forward on foot. The dog followed without hesitation. Every step closer sent adrenaline surging through him. If James was here, or had been, Daniel would find him. As he neared the outer fence, he noticed something strange. No guards, no movement. The place looked deserted, but the air was thick with something unseen, something wrong. His instincts screamed at him. Then a sound, a faint rustling, barely noticeable. Daniel froze. The dog let out a low, almost silent growl. They weren't alone. Before he could react, a shadow moved behind him. And then everything went dark. Daniel's world blurred as consciousness slipped in and out like waves crashing against a distant shore. His head throbbed, his limbs felt heavy, and the cold ground beneath him sent a chill deep into his bones. He wasn't sure how much time had passed since the darkness swallowed him. Seconds? Minutes? Longer? A muffled sound cut through the haze, a low growl. The dog. Daniel forced his eyes open. The dim glow of a single overhead light flickered, casting long shadows along the concrete walls. His hands were bound behind his back, the rough bite of zip ties cutting into his wrists. His ankles were tied too. Across from him, the dog stood stiff, hackles raised, teeth bared at the darkness beyond the light. Someone was there, watching, waiting. A slow shuffle echoed from the far side of the room. Then a voice, calm, measured. "You should have stayed away, Carter." Daniel tensed. That voice, he knew it. A figure stepped forward, just beyond the reach of the light. The man was older than Daniel remembered, his face lined, his hair streaked with gray, but there was no mistaking who he was. James Reynolds. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But it was. His best friend, the man he had mourned for years, was standing right in front of him. James studied him, his expression unreadable. You shouldn't have come here. Daniel's heart pounded against his ribs. You're alive? The words barely made it past his lips. James let out a slow breath, shaking his head. That depends on what you mean by alive. 1,000 questions swarmed Daniel's mind, but he could only get one out. Where the hell have you been? James didn't answer right away. His gaze flicked to the dog, then back to Daniel. I was taken. The mission went south, and I was captured. But not by the enemy. Not in the way we thought. His voice was calm, but there was something in his eyes. Something hollow. The people who took me, they weren't looking for prisoners. They were looking for assets. Daniel felt a chill crawl up his spine. What do you mean? James exhaled, running a hand through his hair. They didn't want to kill me. They wanted to use me, to turn me into something else, something off the books. Daniel stared at him, trying to make sense of what he was saying. Who are they? James gave a humorless chuckle. People with too much power and no accountability. The kind who can make someone disappear and rewrite their existence. That's what they did to me. His jaw tightened. And I let them. Daniel frowned. What? James stepped closer, his face darkening. I made a deal to survive. At first, I thought I could play along long enough to escape. But the more I learned, the more I realized there was no getting out. The only way to walk away was to become something else. Daniel's stomach twisted. What did you do? James was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke. I became one of them. The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. The man standing in front of him wasn't just a survivor. He was part of the very thing Daniel had been searching for. His mind reeled. Was James a prisoner or a willing participant? Had he been looking for a way out? Or had he become so deep in this world that he no longer wanted one? Daniel struggled against the zip ties, his muscles tensing. If that's true, then why am I here? James' expression darkened. Because you started asking the wrong questions. You poked at things that were meant to stay buried. Daniel's blood ran cold. So what happens now? James didn't answer. But Daniel already knew. He had come looking for the truth. And now, he wasn't sure if he would make it out alive to tell it. Daniel's pulse hammered in his ears as he stared at James, the weight of everything pressing down on him. His best friend, the man he had mourned, the man he had spent years grieving, was standing right in front of him, but he wasn't the same. Something had changed. There was a coldness in his eyes, a distance that hadn't been there before. The dog let out a low growl, snapping Daniel's focus back to the moment. He was still tied up, still trapped, and James held all the power in the situation. But Daniel knew his friend, at least he thought he did, somewhere beneath whatever had been done to him. The man he once knew had to still be there. You don't have to do this, Daniel said carefully, watching James' every move. You don't have to be a part of whatever this is. James let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. You still don't get it, do you? There is no leaving. There is no escape. I made my choice a long time ago. Daniel's jaw tightened. Then why am I still alive? James didn't answer right away. His eyes flickered with something. Hesitation, doubt, regret. Because I owed you that much, he finally said. Because once a long time ago, we were brothers. Daniel swallowed hard. We still are. James exhaled sharply, turning away. No, you don't understand. His voice was lower now, almost unsteady. I tried to come back. I tried to find a way out. But by the time I realized what I had gotten myself into, it was too late. They erased me. They turned me into something else. The moment I left that place, I wasn't James Reynolds anymore. Daniel felt his chest tighten. You're still him. Maybe not the same, but you're still in there. He shifted against his restraints, his wrists burning from the zip ties. You sent the dog, didn't you? James hesitated. Daniel pressed on. You wanted me to find you. You knew I would follow the trail. He shook his head. You're telling me you're too far gone. But if that were true, you wouldn't have let me get this far. James clenched his jaw. It doesn't matter now. It does. Daniel's voice was firm. If you really wanted to bury the past, I wouldn't be here. But I am. For a moment, the room was silent. Then James exhaled and reached into his pocket. Daniel braced himself, expecting the worst. Instead, James pulled out a knife and stepped forward. Before Daniel could react, James sliced through the zip ties on his wrists, then moved to his ankles. The bindings fell away, leaving Daniel rubbing his sore wrists, still unsure what was happening. "You need to leave," James said, his voice urgent now. "There's a car outside. Keys are in the ignition. Take the dog and go." Daniel pushed himself to his feet, his muscles aching from being restrained. "What about you?" James didn't answer. Daniel stepped closer. "James!" "I can't," James interrupted, shaking his head. "If I leave, they'll come after both of us. They'll never stop. The only way this ends is if I stay." Daniel's stomach twisted. "That's not an option." James gave him a hard look. "It's the only option." Daniel wanted to argue, but deep down he knew James was right. Whatever this organization was, whatever power they held, they wouldn't let James walk away. And if Daniel stayed any longer, they'd make sure he disappeared too. James took a step back, his expression unreadable. "You never saw me. You never found anything. You move on." Daniel clenched his jaw. "I can't do that." James' eyes darkened. "Yes, you can. And you will." The dog whined softly, stepping closer to Daniel. It was as if it knew what was happening, as if it could sense the finality in James' words. Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat. "Is this really it?" James looked at him for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then he nodded. "Take care of yourself, Carter." Daniel wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he gave James one last look, one that said everything he couldn't say out loud, before turning toward the door. The dog followed close at his heels as he stepped outside. The air was cold, the wind sharp against his face. The car was there, just like James had said. The keys were in the ignition. He hesitated for just a moment, glancing back at the building. But James was already gone. Daniel clenched his fists, then slid into the driver's seat. The dog jumped in beside him. With one last look in the rearview mirror, he started the engine. The road stretched out before him, dark and uncertain. He didn't know what came next, but he knew one thing for sure. James Reynolds was alive, and one day, somehow, Daniel would find a way to bring him home.